In the abortion debate, there is one question that many pro-choicers refuse to answer. There are videos in which a pro-life politician asks this question, and then pro-choice witnesses become so annoyed that they never answer it. Instead, they call it offensive or inflammatory. But why? Why do they avoid the question? Because it exposes a problem that can undermine the pro-choice position. Here's the question. If abortion should be allowed, then should killing an infant also be allowed? Peter Singer and other pro-choicers who don't avoid the question say that the answer is yes. Now, before you think that's crazy, consider the scenario. Imagine a woman that's abandoned by her husband after she gives birth to their child, and she doesn't have enough money to raise the child even if the baby's father offers financial help. Should the mother be allowed to end the life of her 1-month-old infant, or at least request that doctors do it? Some of you will say no, even if you are pro-choice. But here's the problem. Financial hardship is one of the main reasons why women get an abortion. This is confirmed by many sources, some of which are linked in the description. So the question is, if financial hardship can justify ending the life of a fetus, then why can't it justify ending the life of an infant? You might argue that the death of a fetus and the death of an infant are very different. But are they? Some pro-choicers don't think so. For instance, Michael Tooley says that fetuses and infants do not have a right to life. And Peter Singer, Helga Hughes, and Jeff McMahon also support infanticide. As Chadwick and Schüklenk say, jointly with Helga Hughes, Singer argued that we should consider permitting infanticide on parental request of certainly severely disabled newborns. Jeff McMahon agrees with Singer and Hughes that moral consistency requires of those who reject infanticide but support abortion to reconsider their views. So, if abortion should be allowed, then should killing an infant also be allowed? Some pro-choicers say yes, and in section 3 I will explain that they might be right. I am not arguing that infanticide should be legal or that we should be pro-choice and pro-infanticide. I am only saying that if you are pro-choice and anti-infanticide, then you need to show that your position is consistent. You need to show that there is a relevant difference between abortion and infanticide. Otherwise, a pro-lifer can argue that the pro-choice position leads to infanticide, and infanticide should not be allowed, so abortion should not be allowed either. This is the strategy that's used by David and Rose Hershenov in their article, If Abortion, Then Infanticide. There's a lot at stake, so let's begin our analysis. Section 2. Two definitions. Before we get to the main part of this video, let's quickly go over two definitions. First, killing is the act of causing a living thing to become dead. This definition does not entail that killing is always bad. For instance, I think it's permissible for a victim to kill a criminal out of self-defense. Second, infanticide is the killing of an infant. I'm using the term infanticide because that's the term that's often used. Also, there's some ambiguity about whether infanticide means the killing of an infant or the killing of a newborn. But this ambiguity will not affect our analysis. The point is that infanticide refers to the killing of a human that's outside of the womb and very young, like a 1-month-old human. Section 3. Reasons for supporting abortion. I think these are the 6 most popular reasons for supporting abortion. Now, in this section I will answer the following question. Do these reasons apply to infanticide? In other words, can we use these reasons to justify infanticide? I will argue that for reasons 2 to 6, the answer is yes, and for reason 1, the answer is no, but reason 1 is not a good justification of abortion. If all of this is correct, then it seems inconsistent to be pro-choice and anti-infanticide, because there is no good reason that applies to abortion that doesn't also apply to infanticide. Let's start with reason 1. Abortion should be allowed because a woman's body is the woman's body. In other words, it's the woman's body, so whether the woman gets an abortion should be the woman's choice. This is the idea behind the slogan, My Body, My Choice. Reason 1 refers to bodily autonomy, and is one of the most common reasons for supporting abortion. Now, does reason 1 apply to infanticide? No, since infants are outside of the woman's body and they're not directly dependent on the woman's body. Still, should reason 1 convince us to be pro-choice? No, because reason 1 entails an argument that I already criticized in my video called Debunking the Bodily Autonomy Argument for Abortion. In that video, I argued that it's problematic to use bodily autonomy to justify abortion, so even if reason 1 does not apply to infanticide, reason 1 is not a good justification of abortion. If you use bodily autonomy to justify abortion, or you believe that birth is a relevant difference between abortion and infanticide, then you should watch that video. Now let's analyze reason 2. Abortion should be allowed because it is more beneficial to allow abortion than to not allow abortion. Reason 2 is one of the most common reasons for supporting abortion. Now, does reason 2 apply to infanticide? I think the answer is yes, at least sometimes. Let's look at 3 cases: economic harm to the mother, psychological harm to the mother, and harm to the offspring. Let's start with the first case. Some people justify abortion by saying that the existence of the fetus is economically harmful to the mother. As I already mentioned in this video, financial hardship is one of the main reasons why women get an abortion. Now, could the woman get an abortion instead of delivering the child and then killing it? Yes. But what if her financial situation changes dramatically only after the child is born? For instance, what if she becomes a single mom only after the child's birth? There is no guarantee that a woman's financial situation remains the same before and after giving birth. So if it's okay to kill the fetus for financial reasons, then killing the infant for financial reasons should also be okay. As Jubilini and Minerva say, if economical, social, or psychological circumstances change such that taking care of the offspring becomes an unbearable burden on someone, then people should be given the chance of not being forced to do something they cannot afford. Now, you might say that there is a difference between the fetus and an infant. For instance, maybe the fetus is not viable while the infant is. But the problem is that you're using another reason to justify abortion. Instead of saying that abortion should be allowed because it is more beneficial to allow abortion than to not allow abortion, now you are saying that abortion should be allowed because the fetus is not viable. That's reason 5 in this video, so we'll deal with it later. The point is that if financial reasons are sufficient to justify killing a fetus, then financial reasons are also sufficient to justify killing an infant. Otherwise, we're being inconsistent. If I say that John deserves healthcare because he's a human, then I am saying that being a human is sufficient to make someone deserve healthcare. So if I say that Mark, another human, does not deserve healthcare, then I am being inconsistent. In this case, I don't really believe that John deserves healthcare because he's a human. Otherwise, I would have also argued that Mark deserves healthcare. Now let's look at the second case: psychological harm to the mother. Some people justify abortion by saying that the existence of the fetus is psychologically harmful to the mother. For instance, some people say that women should be allowed to decide when and whether to become a parent. Otherwise, they may feel stress, anxiety, and depression. Okay, fair enough. However, these reasons also apply to killing an infant, not just killing a fetus. Raising an infant can negatively impact the mother's psychology, such as when the father leaves the mother after the child is born. Also, the mother can discover that she is not ready to raise a child, even if she thought she was ready before giving birth. In short, there is no guarantee that a woman's psychological situation remains the same before and after giving birth. So if it's okay to kill the fetus for psychological reasons, then it seems that killing the infant for psychological reasons should also be okay. Now let's look at the third and final case: harm to the offspring. Some people justify abortion by saying that the existence of the fetus is harmful to the fetus. In other words, some people justify abortion when the fetus suffers from a serious condition or a severe disease. As Jubilini and Minerva say, severe abnormalities of the fetus and risks for the physical and/or psychological health of the woman are often cited as valid reasons for abortion. But if an infant or a newborn suffers from the same condition or disease, then infanticide should also be allowed for the same reason. Besides, sometimes the condition or disease is only discovered after birth. As Jubilini and Minerva say, such an issue arises, for example, when an abnormality has not been detected during pregnancy or occurs during delivery. Moreover, abnormalities are not always or cannot always be diagnosed through prenatal screening even if they have a genetic origin. Once these children are born, there is no choice for the parents but to keep the child, which sometimes is exactly what they would not have done if the disease had been diagnosed before birth. The point is that if abortion should be allowed because the fetus has a certain condition or disease, then killing an infant should also be allowed if the infant has the same condition or disease. Long story short, reason 2 applies to abortion and infanticide in some cases. So if you use reason 2 to justify abortion, then for the sake of consistency, you may need to use reason 2 to justify infanticide in some cases. Now, should reason 2 convince us to be pro-choice? Maybe, maybe not. To save time, let's move on to reason 3. The most important thing for this video is that reason 2 applies to infanticide at least sometimes. Now let's analyze reason 3. Abortion should be allowed because the woman did not consent to getting pregnant, even if she consented to having sex. Does reason 3 apply to infanticide? Yes, at least usually. A woman that doesn't consent to getting pregnant usually doesn't consent to giving birth to the child and keeping it. Now, someone might say that if a woman doesn't get an abortion, then she shouldn't be allowed to kill her infant because she had plenty of time to get an abortion instead. However, if consent is all that matters, then even if the woman had plenty of time to get an abortion, it still doesn't change the fact that if somehow she doesn't get an abortion, then she should be allowed to kill her infant as long as she didn't consent to having the infant. Besides, if consent is all that matters, then if a woman consents to getting pregnant and to giving birth, but doesn't consent to keeping the infant alive or giving it for adoption, then the woman should be allowed to kill her infant. All in all, reason 3 can apply to infanticide. Now, should reason 3 convince us to be pro-choice? Probably not, and here's why. Reason 3 entails the following argument. If the woman did not consent to getting pregnant, then abortion should be allowed. The woman did not consent to getting pregnant. Therefore, abortion should be allowed. I think the problem is that premise 1 is false. The fact that the woman did not consent to getting pregnant is not sufficient to determine that abortion should be allowed. That's because all humans should be held responsible for the outcomes of their voluntary choices, even if they did not specifically intend or desire those outcomes. For instance, suppose that John decides to shoot fireworks, and he does everything in his power to ensure that they don't harm anyone, like pointing them up in the air away from people. However, something unexpected happens. The fireworks malfunction, or a strong wind pushes the fireworks to a new direction. Either way, the fireworks end up hitting a person and harming them, or even killing them. Should John be held responsible for that outcome? Yes. John shot the fireworks, so he should compensate for the damage that he caused, even though he did his best to prevent those outcomes. A similar analysis applies to aborting a child that was born through voluntary sex. There's a voluntary action, precaution is taken, yet there's an unexpected outcome that affects someone else. Still, the woman should be held responsible for the outcomes of her actions. That's why premise 1 is false. The fact that the woman did not consent to getting pregnant is not sufficient to determine that abortion should be allowed. Maybe you don't agree with the fireworks analogy, but you still reject premise 1 if you think there is at least one instance where all humans should be held responsible for the outcomes of their voluntary choices, even if they did not specifically intend or desire those outcomes. To finish, regardless of whether reason 3 should convince us to be pro-choice, reason 3 usually applies to infanticide, so pro-choicers who are anti-infanticide should not use reason 3 to justify abortion. Now let's analyze reason 4. Abortion should be allowed because the fetus is not rational, or the fetus is not cognitive, or something like that. For instance, abortion should be allowed because the fetus is not self-conscious, or because the fetus doesn't have goals. Now, does reason 4 apply to infanticide? I think the answer is yes. This is debatable, and it depends on what we mean by rational. Richard Arneson says that there are evidently different components of rational agency capacity, such as the ability to perceive features of one's environment, the ability to recognize and assess reasons for choice, the ability to deliberate and choose, the ability to form intentions and carry through what one has decided, and so on. I think many infants don't meet some of these criteria. Still, for us to determine whether reason 4 applies to infanticide, we need to specify what we mean by rationality, and then we need to have convincing evidence that shows that infants have, or do not have, rationality. All of this is beyond the scope of this video, but I think it's plausible to say that reason 4 applies to infanticide. Now let's answer the second question. Should reason 4 convince us to be pro-choice? Probably not, and here's why. Reason 4 entails the following argument. If the fetus is not rational, then abortion should be allowed. The fetus is not rational. Therefore, abortion should be allowed. Premise 2 may be true. It depends on what we mean by rational. However, even if premise 2 is true, I think that premise 1 is false. I know that this is debatable, and I will not try to solve this issue here, but let me give you an example that shows why I think premise 1 is false. Consider sponges, the animals, not the stuff you use in the kitchen to clean the dishes. Sponges are animals, they are alive, and most likely they are not rational. Also, killing all sponges in the world is probably very harmful to humans. If you do research on sponges, you will see that they are important for the environment and for humans. So, let's suppose that sponges are not rational, and that killing all sponges is more harmful to humans than not killing all sponges. Should anyone be allowed to kill all sponges? My answer is no, and I think that's a plausible answer. Lindsay Porter would agree, since she says that killing tree lobsters is impermissible because doing so is harmful to the environment and humans, even if tree lobsters are not rational. So, If it's plausible to say that no one should be allowed to kill all sponges, then it is plausible to say the following. The fact that sponges are not rational is not sufficient to determine that killing sponges should be allowed. More generally, the fact that something is not rational is not sufficient to determine that killing it should be allowed. Therefore, even if the fetus is not rational, that is not sufficient to determine that killing it should be allowed. So premise 1 is false, and thus reason 4 should not be convincing. We could analyze this issue in more details, but I at least wanted to give you an idea of why I think premise 1 is false. There's one more thing to consider, the equality problem. We say that all humans should be treated equally, but it's very hard to justify that claim. Thomas Cristiano says that this is one of the most profound problems of moral philosophy. Even Kai Nielsen, a socialist, admits that he is not aware of a proof for egalitarianism. I mention this because one way to argue for human equality is to say that all humans are rational, but this doesn't work because rationality isn't all or nothing. It comes in degrees, even among adults. Later, we can analyze the equality problem. For now, here's what's important. If you argue that abortion should be allowed because the fetus is not rational, then you might have to give up the idea of human equality, because this kind of reasoning doesn't seem to support the claim that all humans should be treated equally. To summarize, does reason 4 apply to infanticide? I think the answer is yes. So if you are anti-infanticide and you use reason 4 to justify abortion, then you need to show that reason 4 does not apply to infanticide. Also, should reason 4 convince us to be pro-choice? Probably not. I know that's debatable, so if you accept reason 4, then you need to show that people should accept premises 1 and 2. Now let's analyze reason 5. Abortion should be allowed because the fetus is not viable. In other words, abortion should be allowed because the fetus is unable to survive outside of the woman's body. Does reason 5 apply to infanticide? Yes, at least sometimes. If not viable means unable to survive outside of the woman's body without any assistance, then reason 5 applies to infanticide, since infants up to a certain age are unable to survive without any assistance. For instance, if you leave infants alone, they will die because they will not feed themselves. As John T. Noonan Jr. says, a child of 1 or 3 or even 5 years of age is absolutely dependent on another's care for existence. Uncared for, the older fetus or the younger child will die as surely as the early fetus detached from the mother. Now, if not viable means unable to survive outside of the woman's body with some assistance, then reason 5 applies to some infants, such as those who are born with anencephaly or with bilateral renal agenesis. These are cases where the infant will probably die soon, even if there is medical assistance. Overall, we need to specify what viability means before we can determine how much reason 5 applies to infanticide. Now let's deal with the second question. Should reason 5 convince us to be pro-choice? Probably not, and here's why. Reason 5 entails the following argument. If the fetus is not viable, then abortion should be allowed. The fetus is not viable, therefore abortion should be allowed. My criticism is that even if premise 2 is true, I think that premise 1 is false. For instance, if legalizing abortion is harmful to society, then it seems plausible to me that abortion should not be legal, regardless of whether the fetus is viable. This is debatable, but my point is that if you accept reason 5, then you need to explain why premise 1 is true. I've never heard a convincing argument for it. All in all, if you argue that abortion should be allowed because the fetus is not viable, then you need to offer a convincing argument for that claim. And you need to consider that infants may also not be viable depending on how you define viability. Now let's analyze reason 6, the last reason that we'll talk about in this video. Abortion should be allowed because the fetus does not feel pain. Does reason 6 apply to infanticide? Yes, in a few cases. Usually, reason 6 does not apply to infanticide, since most infants feel pain at least to some extent. However, there are rare occasions where an infant does not feel pain, like someone that has congenital insensitivity to pain. So, for the most part, reason 6 does not apply to infanticide. But there are a few exceptions, so if you use reason 6 to justify abortion, then you should be okay with infanticide in the few cases where an infant does not feel pain. Now, even if reason 6 mostly does not apply to infanticide, should reason 6 convince us to be pro-choice? Probably not. Reason 6 entails the following argument. If the fetus does not feel pain, then abortion should be allowed. The fetus does not feel pain. Therefore, abortion should be allowed. Premise 2 may be true only to a certain extent. It depends on whether the fetus feels pain at some point during the pregnancy. But even if premise 2 is true, I think that premise 1 is false. I could use the same sponge example that I used when talking about reason 4. Basically, no one should be allowed to kill all sponges because killing them would cause great harm to society. If that's correct, then the fact that sponges don't feel pain is not sufficient to determine that killing sponges should be allowed. More generally, the fact that something doesn't feel pain is not sufficient to determine that killing it should be allowed. Therefore, even if the fetus does not feel pain, that is not sufficient to determine that killing it should be allowed. So premise 1 is false, and thus reason 6 should not be convincing. This is debatable, but I at least wanted to give you an idea of why I think premise 1 is false. What's more important for this video is that reason 6 applies to infanticide in a few cases. So pro-choicers who are anti-infanticide should not use reason 6 to justify abortion. Section 4. Conclusion. In this video, we looked at the following question. If abortion should be allowed, then should killing an infant also be allowed? Some pro-choicers say yes, and I explained that these pro-choicers might be right. In Section 3, we looked at 6 popular ways to justify abortion, and I argued that reasons 2 to 6 apply to infanticide, while reason 1 should not be convincing even if it doesn't apply to infanticide. If all of this is correct, then being pro-choice and anti-infanticide seems inconsistent. What do you think? Leave a comment below if you have any thoughts, criticisms, or suggestions. My next video will be on the regress problem. It's a foundational issue and I need to go over it before I talk about what I think is the most important problem in politics and ethics. Thank you for watching and I hope you have a great day.